The Mafia boss is flatlining, 15 elite doctors are panicking, and his trigger-happy younger brother just gave them a countdown before the whole room turns into a graveyard. But here's the insane part. The one who catches the murder setup isn't some genius surgeon, it's a broke delivery driver, a single mom working 3 jobs, who walks in at 2 a.m. and smells something all those experts missed. And the second she opens her mouth, the entire empire starts cracking.
That final surgeon didn't set aside his blade out of satisfaction. He quit because every hope had evaporated. 67 stories above the Windy City, in a residence worth more than a dozen generations, Santino Castellano's life was leaking away. His pulse wasn't merely fading, it was being commanded to surrender. 15 world-class medical masters surrounded the bed, their $800 an hour hands trembling like terrified students on day one. Dr. Helena Cross, who once revived a president in a moving helicopter, couldn't find a steady rhythm. Beside her, Nobel-level genius Rajan Mehta stared at the screen as if it were written in a forgotten, ancient tongue. Past the sterile barriers, 400 gunmen waited in the shadows. They all understood the stakes. If the patriarch falls, Chicago burns. Kilian Castellano, a man who spoke through a gold-plated firearm and a viciously short temper, issued his final decree. You have 8 minutes. My brother poured $60 million into this floor and $15 million more, keeping you experts on call. If he stays under, none of you take the elevator down. You will leave through the glass. But the salvation didn't come from a lab or a machine. It didn't come from a genius in a white coat. It came from Jolene Hadley, a 27-year-old delivery driver and single mother barely surviving on 3 jobs. She arrived at 2 a.m. carrying bags of premium steak for a private order, a restaurant she didn't realize was secretly owned by the very empire that was currently dying upstairs. A $500 tip was the only light on her phone. In her battered truck, 4-year-old Rosie slept with a tattered teddy bear named Mr. Boots. Jolene wasn't a guest, yet she caught a scent near the pillow that the $1 million sensors missed, a smell the experts couldn't even recognize. She recognized it instantly from her father's South Side basement before he vanished without a trace 4 years ago. This wasn't a medical tragedy, it was a cold-blooded execution. And the shadow responsible was still breathing the same air-conditioned air inside that tower. If this chilling tale has your heart thumping, tap that like button to join the family. Send this to a fellow mystery lover and hit subscribe right now. You won't want to be left in the dark for the chapters coming next. Back in that high-altitude tomb, the most feared man in the Midwest was a breath away from the void. The only hope was a woman the elites had deemed invisible. Below her feet, the marble floor caught the monitor's sterile blue glow, turning the suite into a cold waiting room for the afterlife. Heavy velvet drapes erased the city lights, isolating the room from the living world. The sharp sting of antiseptic clashed with lingering, expensive perfume, creating a suffocating atmosphere where every inhale tasted of extreme wealth and impending rot. Santo lay ashen and still, his eyes locked shut, but his left hand was performing a miracle of horror. His fingers weren't twitching in a random fit. They were moving with a haunting, deliberate cadence, as though his nerves were playing a slow funeral hymn on an invisible keyboard. Ignoring the hand, Dr. Cross focused on the screen where the pulse was a dying ripple. She gripped a 15-centimeter needle, the ultimate gamble designed to slam through the ribs and shock the muscle back to life. This was the final act, often called death's hammer. It either breathes life or seals the casket. As she moved to strike, Maida grabbed her arm. His voice was quiet but heavy, with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades studying the heart's secret dialogue with the brain. Look at his fingers, Helena. That is not a random spasm from lack of air. It is a rhythmic cycle every 3 seconds. This isn't a heart failing on its own. It is an active command from the brain telling the body to stop breathing. Cross argued that the toxicology screens were pristine, with no poison in sight. With only 2 minutes left, the clock was screaming. Maida fired back, asking what happens when you force a heart to start when its own nervous system is demanding it to die. You won't save him. You will shatter the muscle. He will die by our hands, and that blood will be on us. The room went silent. 13 other doctors watched the standoff, caught between two legends while the king of the underworld lay dying between them. In this world, a mistake meant a bullet, not a court date. Tucked in the shadows, Dr. Silas Marchetti stood perfectly still. He offered no advice, just leaned against the wall, obsessively mopping a heavy, unnatural sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. This wasn't the sweat of a man under pressure. It was the perspiration of a man watching a countdown he had started himself. Silas knew exactly when the clock would hit 0, but everyone else was too distracted by the needle to notice. All eyes were fixed on the steel point and the rhythmic tapping of Santo's fingers. It was 2:17 in the morning, and in the kitchen below, a delivery girl was about to step into a war zone. Killian didn't wait for a medical consensus. He grabbed his phone and issued a cold command. Lock down the top 10 floors, kill anyone who moves, and let nobody in or out. His word was law, and in his world, law was absolute. Below them, 400 soldiers sealed the exits. Elevators died, and stairwells were bolted shut. The tower transformed into a 70-story steel cage. Every soul inside was now a hostage to Killian's desperation. He pocketed the phone and stared at his brother's gray face and rhythmic hand. Killian saw a pattern that the scientists were blind to, a haunting echo of a ghost he had seen once before. He remembered it from 17 years ago, in a lonely hospital room. Killian was only 16 then, a boy forged in violence, sitting by his mother, Margarita. She had been reduced to a waxy, yellow shell by someone else's cruelty. Organic arsenic had been her end, slipped into red wine at a rival's party. By the time they realized it, her body was already shutting down. He could still smell the lilies and the plastic tubes of that final night. He remembered the machine's long, flat note and the way he screamed until his voice failed him. Then Santo arrived, 19 and stone-faced. No tears, no noise, just a brother stepping into the wreckage. Santo had pulled him into a grip so tight it felt like they shared one heart. He whispered a single vow into Killian's ear. Never again. That promise became the foundation of their entire empire. Months later, the family responsible simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no traces. Now, looking at Santo's twitching hand, Killian realized the nightmare was repeating. The vow had been broken, and the past was coming for his blood. Killian's fingers were white-knuckled around his gold-plated piece, his grip tight enough to snap the frame. Blood was going to spill tonight. He just hadn't picked the target yet. "Take a breath, Killian," came a voice from the shadows, chillingly calm and void of all warmth. Jude Thorne didn't so much enter the light as he chose to be perceived. At 62 years old, the veteran advisor to the Castellano family was a ghost in plain sight. He was the kind of man you could sit beside for an hour without noticing until the moment he decided to speak. By the time he opened his mouth, your options had already run out. Dressed in a sharp gray three-piece, he leaned on an ebony cane topped with silver. That cane wasn't for support, it housed a 30-centimeter blade, a silent guarantee that Jude Thorne always had the final word. His unblinking stare swept from Killian to Santo, then flickered over the 15 terrified doctors huddled like lambs in a slaughterhouse. At the entrance stood Declan Voss, a human barricade. 45 years old and a former SEAL, he carried secrets from a mission the government had scrubbed from existence. Declan didn't wear a suit for show. He was a walking omen of violence that made everyone's skin crawl instinctively. His eyes were a restless blur, never pausing for more than 2 seconds. A lethal habit forged while scanning the scorched streets of Fallujah for hidden explosives. He ignored the medical jargon, focusing only on hands and hidden threats. It was 2:20 in the morning. Santa remained motionless while Dr. Cross held the adrenaline needle poised. Meanwhile, behind the kitchen's swinging door, a pair of hidden eyes watched the scene unfold. Those eyes belonged to a woman who had just detected a scent she spent years trying to forget. 30 minutes before the chaos erupted in the medical suite, Jolene Hadley was sitting in a battered truck behind Vecchio's, her face lit by the cold glow of her phone. A late-night delivery popped up. 3 high-end steaks and wine for the 67th floor. The tip was $500. She blinked at the screen. That was 3 nights of grueling work or a third of the rent she was already 3 months behind on. It meant keeping the cramped studio where little Rosie had to share her mother's bed. It meant stalling the landlord who had already plastered eviction notices all over their door. Jolene looked back at her daughter, who was huddled under a threadbare blanket. The girl was clutching Mr. Boots, a one-eyed bear with stuffing leaking from its neck. No 4-year-old should be in a truck at 1:30 in the morning, but on the south side, childcare was $15 an hour. Choosing between a sitter and milk wasn't a choice, it was a slow-motion tragedy. She hit accept. Steering with one hand, she reached back to steady Rosie as they pulled out. This was her grind. Prep work all morning, scrubbing offices until 10 at night, and then deliveries until her vision blurred. It was a life measured in exhaustion. 4 hours of sleep was a luxury. Her right hand throbbed with inflammation, requiring 10 minutes in boiling water every morning just to move her fingers. At 27, her body was a wreck, usually reserved for these in their 50s, and not all the scars were from hard labor. 3 of her ribs had been shattered years ago. Not by a crash, but by Derek Hadley. Her ex, a cop, had kicked her while she was 7 months pregnant because he was drowning in whiskey. Back then, every unwashed dish or wrong look was a reason for him to strike. Jolene had curled on the floor, protecting her belly while Rosie kicked inside her, swearing she would never let him near the child again. She made good on that vow, fleeing to a women's shelter before finding their tiny studio. Derek never came looking for them. He hadn't let her go out of kindness. His car had turned into a fireball on Interstate 90 at 3 in the morning. The authorities called it a mechanical failure. When the news came, Jolene didn't shed a tear. There was only a hollow, echoing silence where her grief should have been. Yet Derek wasn't her deepest wound. That belonged to her father, Raymond Hadley, who vanished without a trace years earlier. No note, no warning, just an open front door and a basement lab that had been wiped clean as if he never existed. The police gave up after 3 weeks. Years passed, and Jolene eventually stopped dialing his disconnected number. She tried to convince herself he simply didn't want the burden of a broken daughter, that she wasn't worth the trouble of staying. Believing he abandoned her was easier than imagining the alternative, which would have destroyed her spirit. Now, her truck idled at the base of the Castellano Tower, 67 stories of steel cutting through the dark like a razor. She gathered a sleeping Rosie in one arm and the delivery bags in the other, stepping into the lobby. A private lift whisked her up to the top floor. When the doors slid open, she found herself staring at a wall of a man. Declan Voss didn't offer a greeting. He just stood there, cold and immovable, ordering her to drop the bags and show her hands. His voice carried the weight of a man who had ended many lives. Jolene obeyed, shielding her daughter with her own body. He tossed her belongings and searched her person with the efficiency of a soldier at a checkpoint. Then he jerked a thumb toward the kitchen. Once inside, with the door nearly shut, a familiar aroma began to bleed through the air. It was a scent that should have remained a memory. Jolene gently placed Rosie on a kitchen sofa, wrapping her in the thin blanket and tucking the teddy bear under her chin. She did everything she could to keep the girl from waking in this den of lions. When she stood up, the fragrance hit her again, drifting through the crack in the door. It was subtle, almost like a ghost, but undeniable. Lavender. But beneath the floral notes was something sharper, more acrid, a hidden layer only an expert would notice. Most people would have missed it, but Jolene knew better. Through the gap, she saw Santo's hand twitching rhythmically against the bedding. The doctors were locked in a heated debate until Killian's low voice cut through the room like a knife. Jolene wasn't listening to the argument. She was staring at the silk draped over Santo's pillow. That fabric carried the scent she was deciphering. Then she noticed the cold pot of mint tea on the nightstand, and the connection was made. Seeing that teapot next to the scented silk pulled her mind back 15 years. Suddenly, she wasn't in a penthouse. She was back in her father's basement on the south side, surrounded by the shadows of his secret work. 12-year-old Jolene sat on a tall swivel stool, her legs dangling into a cold room that smelled of alchemical secrets. Raymond Hadley's workshop lacked the sterile gleam of cinema labs. It was more akin to a rustic apothecary. Instead of chalkboards, there were rows of glass jars filled with dried botanicals and essential oils, alongside leather books with spines worn down by her father's obsessive hands. Raymond held 2 small vials toward his daughter's face. "Close your eyes and tell me." The young girl inhaled. "Lavender." He gave her a weary, bittersweet smile. "Try this one." Jolene breathed in the second scent. It was a perfect mirror of the first. "Lavender again?" Raymond shook his head. "No, my sweet. This is lavender hiding a shadow. Grayanotoxin distilled from rhododendron honey. The fragrance is identical, but there is a ghostly bitterness at the end, like scorched almonds. A machine would take 40 minutes to find it, yet your senses caught it in 2 seconds." Jolene's brow furrowed, wondering why anyone would mask poison with flowers. Raymond set the bottles down, his eyes heavy with the weight of things he wished he could forget. Because, little one, a true predator never uses what the victim fears. They use what the victim loves, what they pull close every night before sleep. Your nose is the first and final laboratory. Machines can be fooled, but the senses never lie. 15 years later, standing in a 67th floor penthouse, Jolene opened her eyes to find her hand was shaking. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The silk on Santo's pillow was saturated with synthetic grayanotoxin, a ghost molecule derived from honey that no standard toxicology screen would ever flag. On its own, inhaling the toxin would only cause a flutter in the chest or a brief spell of nausea, never enough to extinguish a life. But the mint tea resting on the nightstand, Jolene would bet her soul it was laced with a trace of cesium chloride, a dose so minuscule that blood tests would dismiss it as background noise. Separately, these substances were nearly harmless, but together they formed a lethal cross-reaction, overstimulating the vagus nerve, the great conductor of the brain, heart, and lungs. When that nerve is forced into overdrive, it whispers a single, final command to the heart: stop. The heart itself was healthy and strong, yet the body was being tricked into suicide. This was why 15 world-class doctors were failing. They were hunting for a sickness, but they were looking at a masterpiece of sabotage. This was a cold-blooded assassination wearing the mask of natural failure. Peering through the door, Jolene saw Dr. Cross preparing an adrenaline syringe. If that needle hit his vein, the surge would collide with the vagus nerve suppression, causing a violent internal shock wave rather than a restart. His heart would literally tear itself apart under the pressure. They would end him in their frantic attempt to save him, while the architect of this tragedy walked away without a stain of suspicion. Jolene glanced back at Rosie on the couch. Her little girl was lost in dreams, clutching Mr. Boots as her chest rose and fell in perfect peace. If Jolene stepped into that room of power, she would be a target. A delivery woman in a stained uniform had no place in their world. One wrong word could ensure neither she nor Rosie ever left this 67th floor sanctuary alive. Yet if she remained silent, the man on that bed would vanish within minutes. She would have to carry that ghost forever, just as she carried the memory of her father's end, her late exit from Derek, and every time her own fear had strangled her voice into submission. With one final look at her daughter, Jolene straightened her posture and pushed through the door. "If you push that adrenaline, he'll be dead in 30 seconds. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it sliced through the frantic medical chatter like a cold blade through heavy velvet, demanding every ear in the room. 15 elite doctors froze. Dr. Cross held the needle midair. Killian's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, and Declan Voss felt his combat training kick in as they all stared at the intruder. They saw a 27-year-old woman in a rumpled uniform, hair messy, and eyes shadowed by exhaustion, standing there as if she had fallen from another world. "He is being murdered," Jolene repeated, her voice thin but unwavering. "Right here, in front of all of you." 2 seconds of stunned silence passed before Dr. Rajan broke it with a condescending sneer, the kind of laugh reserved for those who believe they are gods of their craft. "And who exactly are you, Doctor? Google?" Jolene ignored the mockery. She locked eyes with Dr. Cross, the woman holding the power to either save Santo Castellano or seal his fate in the next 30 seconds. "That pillowcase," Jolene said, stepping forward. "It's been treated with lavender, but it's a lie. It's laced with synthetic gray anotoxin from rhododendron honey. It won't show up on your screens because it's been chemically altered to bypass the standard algorithms. Your machines are looking for the wrong ghost." The mocking laughter stopped instantly, not out of belief, but because a common courier had just spoken the language of high-level toxicology. "The tea on the table," Jolene continued, her mind mapping the room's layout with clinical precision. "It's spiked with cesium chloride at a sub-threshold level. It passes every test you've run because it stays below the alarm. By itself, it's nothing. But when he breathes that lavender and drinks that tea, the two substances join forces to hijack his vagus nerve. It's sending a kill code directly to his heart." She pointed at the needle in the doctor's trembling hand. "His heart isn't diseased. It's being ordered to quit. If you flood his system with adrenaline now, it will trigger a catastrophic spasm. He will die on this bed, and everyone here will sign the death certificate as a natural tragedy." The room became a tomb, silent enough to hear the faint beep of the monitor and the heavy thud of a heartbeat. Dr. Cross looked from Jolene to the tea, then to the pillow. She was caught between professional pride and a terrifying instinct. "Check his eyes," Jolene urged. "Ignore the pupils. Look for iris tremor, a rhythmic, subtle twitching. It is the only physical fingerprint synthetic gray anotoxin leaves behind. If I'm lying, use the needle. If I'm right, put it down." Dr. Cross looked to Meta for guidance. The legend didn't move, but his silence was a heavy, unspoken consent. In the high-stakes world of medicine, when a titan like him doesn't say no, it means yes. Dr. Cross pulled a penlight, moved to Santo's side, and peeled back his eyelid. She stared for a long moment, then let out a sharp, ragged breath that only comes when a veteran sees a miracle or a nightmare. The iris wasn't reacting to the light. Instead, it was vibrating, a steady, rhythmic twitch every 3 seconds, echoing the faint movement of the man's dying fingers. "My God," she whispered, turning to Jolene. The woman who had saved presidents now looked utterly lost. "She's right." The adrenaline needle was lowered as her hand began to shake. Meta moved in to see for himself, the blood draining from his face as the truth took hold. The 15 greatest minds in medicine stood paralyzed, realizing they had nearly executed the man they were sworn to protect. In the shadows, Dr. Silas Marchetti stopped sweating. His face was now the color of bone. He looked like a man who had just seen his own executioner walk through the door. Jolene was too focused on the patient to see him, but Jude Thorne was watching, and the old man saw everything. The quiet hadn't even settled before Jolene felt the frigid weight of a gold-etched 9mm biting into her temple. Killian Castellano didn't scream. His words arrived in a lethal, low-frequency hum that vibrated against her skull. There is a specific terror in a man who refuses to shout, for a whisper is the sound of a blade already mid-swing. "Tell me," he murmured, his intent as heavy as lead, "how a girl like you knows things like this." Killian leaned in, his gaze fixed and freezing, his pupils shrinking into 2 jagged points of obsidian. Jolene's pulse hammered against the very spot where the barrel kissed her skin, a frantic rhythm she feared he could feel through the steel. Yet she stood her ground. There was no retreat left for her, only the cold wall and the shadow of a killer. "My father was Raymond Hadley," she replied, her voice stumbling over the first syllable before finding a hard, desperate clarity. Fear was a luxury she had traded for survival long ago. He had been a master of medicine and toxins, a shadow chemist who spent 25 years serving the underground dynasties of the Great Lakes, fixing the lethal mistakes they couldn't take to an emergency room. He vanished 4 years ago without leaving so much as a shadow. From the dimness, the rhythmic click of an ebony cane against the polished marble announced Jude Thorne's approach. He moved with a theatrical, haunting grace, stopping just shy of the medical equipment to study her with eyes that had spent 40 years dissecting the lies of desperate men. "Raymond Hadley," Jude repeated, tasting the name like a bitter secret. He recalled the man, one of the most brilliant invisible minds north of the Ohio River, a ghost who disappeared 4 summers back and stayed gone. He glanced toward Killian, his voice a weary command. "Put the weapon down, son!" But the gun didn't move an inch. Killian's gaze shifted from the woman to the old man, then toward his brother, whose graying form was slowly surrendering to the void. When his eyes finally returned to Jolene, they held the icy, machine-like logic of a predator weighing a blood debt. "If you fail," he warned, the metal still digging into her skin, "death will be a mercy I won't grant you. I will start with the child while you watch." In that moment, the world stopped turning. The rhythmic beep of the life support and the doctor's shallow breaths vanished into a void of absolute silence. That single horrific promise hung in the air, sharp and choking, like the acrid scent of gunpowder in a small room. Slowly, Jolene turned her head, forcing the barrel to slide from her temple across her cheek until she was staring directly into the heart of the storm. The weapon was now centered perfectly between her eyes. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it belonged to a ghost, hollow, ancient, and utterly fearless. It was the voice of a woman who had been broken by life and reconstructed by necessity, a survivor of trauma and exhaustion who had nothing left but the small girl sleeping in the next room. My daughter is 4 years old. She is currently in your kitchen holding a ragged, one-eyed bear named Mr. Boots because I cannot afford a replacement. Jolene's voice dropped to a terrifying quiet register. If you lay a finger on my baby, I will watch your brother die and feel nothing. I will walk over your corpse and your 400 soldiers, take my child, and disappear. Then you can explain to every crime lord from Chicago to Detroit that your brother is in the ground because you chose to threaten the only soul who could save him. Killian stared at her, and for the first time in a life defined by violence and ash, something inside him flickered. It wasn't cowardice. He was a man who didn't understand the concept of fear. It was recognition. He saw a mirror of his own soul, the absolute, monstrous devotion one feels for the blood they protect. He remembered 17 years ago when his brother held him on a blood-soaked hospital floor, vowing to keep them whole. He saw that same fire in this weary woman in her stained uniform. With a sharp, mechanical motion, Killian snapped the gun down toward the floor. "Tell me what you require," he demanded, his voice like cracking ice. Jolene finally drew air into her lungs, a jagged breath 2 minutes in the making. "I need that kitchen for 7 minutes, and I want my daughter up here, away from that truck, this instant." She strode into the penthouse kitchen, the sheer opulence of the room momentarily dazing her. The space was a cathedral of steel and stone, larger than her entire home. It featured industrial ranges and refrigerators that loomed like monuments, all anchored by granite slabs as thick as a man's torso. This was a sanctuary for world-class chefs, not a desperate woman with trembling hands and a dying man's life in her grip. She didn't have the time to break down. Declan Voss appeared, carrying small Rosie with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man with such violent hands. He tucked the sleeping child into a corner sofa as if she were made of glass. Jolene was momentarily stunned that a killer could be so gentle with a sleeping 4-year-old. She pressed a quick, fierce kiss to her daughter's brow before her mind shifted into a cold, professional gear. She dialed Bryn Sawyer, her only ally in the world, a Southside nurse who answered on the second ring despite it being 2:30 in the morning. "Bryn, get to the tower now. Rosie is here, and I need you to guard her. Just come." The clock started. Jolene raided the fridge, her eyes scanning for the specific elements of her father's alchemy. She grabbed 6 organic eggs and separated the whites with a speed and grace born of 1,000 shifts in a professional kitchen. 6 clear pools of protein in a bowl. The yolks were cast aside like yesterday's news. She bypassed the water and went straight for the high-end filtration system, tearing into the housing with frantic strength. She didn't want the liquid. She wanted the black heart of the machine. She shattered the casing and pulled out the solid block of activated carbon, the key to neutralizing the poison. She grabbed a heavy granite mortar and began to pulverize the charcoal. Every strike was rhythmic, a desperate percussion as sweat began to sting her eyes. Dr. Helena Cross watched from the shadows of the doorway, her professional curiosity finally overriding her shock. "Why not use the blender?" the doctor asked softly. Jolene didn't break her rhythm. The friction from the blades would generate heat, sealing the pores of the carbon and rendering it useless. This charcoal works because of its microscopic surface area. If I melt those pores shut, it's just black dust. It was the answer of a scientist, cold and irrefutable. Dr. Cross remained silent, acknowledging the hidden depth of the woman before her. Jolene reached for a $300 jar of Manuka honey, something she could never have bought for her own child's cough. She added 2 heavy measures to the egg whites, followed by a pour of the finest Italian olive oil. As she whisked the concoction, she spoke aloud, the chemical formulas acting as an anchor for her fraying nerves. She wasn't explaining it for the doctor. She was reciting the liturgy of her father's craft to ensure she didn't fail. "The toxin is a closed loop," she whispered, her hand steady as stone. The synthetic gray anatoxin hitches a ride on the blood's lipids, constantly recycling through the gut and shocking the vagus nerve over and over. That is why his heart is failing in cycles. He isn't just poisoned. He is caught in a lethal biological carousel. She added the black powder to the mix. The carbon will trap the toxin before it can re-enter his system. The egg whites will shield his stomach from the fallout, while the honey's compounds dampen the inflammation. The olive oil is the transport delivering the medicine to the exact point of the intestinal failure. Dr. Cross looked at the dark sludge, then at the girl. "Where did you learn this?" That question was a ghost that pulled Jolene back 13 years. She could almost smell the sulfur and chemicals of her father's basement lab. She saw the flicking yellow light of a single bulb and remembered the sound of Raymond's laughter as he recorded her lessons on a grainy old camcorder. In her mind's eye, a 14-year-old Jolene stood beside her father, learning the secret language of acids and bases. Raymond Hadley had been preparing her for a world he knew was coming, a world where the only thing standing between life and a cold grave was the knowledge he left behind. It was a simple lesson for any school child, yet Raymond's wisdom carried a heavier weight. He spoke softly, his voice a comforting hum, reminding her that chemistry is merely a recipe with lethal stakes. One error leads to ruin, one success births a miracle. He promised her kitchen skills would one day serve as a shield. Back then, 14-year-old Jolene merely scoffed, clutching a box of baking soda. Now, 13 years later, she stands in a crime lord's glass palace, her palms stained dark as night and her vision blurred by salt and stress. There was no laughter left. She watched the viscous black fluid coat the glass like ink, ensuring it was thick enough to grip the belly's walls. "It is ready," she whispered, entering the ward where 15 elite physicians stared at her as if she gripped a live explosive. Dr. Mehta blocked her, calling the procedure madness, refusing to let a courier play God with a kitchen slurry. His protest died in his throat as a metallic snap echoed. Killian Castellano leveled his firearm, his gaze frozen and terrifying. "The courier is the lead surgeon now," he growled. "A move without her leave, and I will put a bullet through your skull." The doctor recoiled. Jolene approached the dying man's bed as another physician expertly snaked a tube through his nasal passage, reaching for the gut with practiced clinical coldness. Jolene's voice cut through the air. "Ditch that pillow! He's still breathing in the venom!" She flung the expensive purple silk aside, replacing it with a hard medical rest before drawing the obsidian sludge into a massive syringe. With a rhythmic precision, she pushed the plunger, timing every drop to the pulse in her mind. Panic could kill him. Delay was a death sentence. The liquid vanished into Santo's frame. Silence fell. 60 seconds passed, the monitor showing only the jagged dance of a failing heart. The medical staff stood like statues, eyes glued to the flickering screens. 2 minutes. A chill crawled down Jolene's neck. She had gambled her own life and her daughter's future on a kitchen experiment, betting everything on a ghost's recipe. If she failed, she would never hold her child again. 3 minutes of suffocating quiet followed, broken only by the cold, electronic chirp of the machines. Killian watched his brother, his shadow looming over the bed as the world seemed to stop spinning. His jaw was a ridge of tension. The weapon was gone. Instead, he gripped Santo's hand with the desperation of a boy. It was the same way he had clung to their mother 17 years ago in a hospital hallway before the lights went out for good. Dr. Cross sought answers in Jolene's eyes but found only a silent command to stay the course. 5 minutes. Then the tempo shifted. A subtle acceleration, a hint of strength that made the doctor gasp as the chaotic lines on the screen began to find their path. It felt as if a dying flame had been nursed back to life. A steady pulse returned. Dr. Mehta stepped closer, staring at the monitor and then at the patient's hands. The violent tremors had vanished, leaving only a stillness cradled in Killian's reach. 6 minutes in, the heartbeat found its soul again. The digital mountain peaks grew tall and firm. The gray pallor of Santo's skin began to melt away, like morning mist burning off a frozen lake as the first light of dawn breaks through. Jude Thorne ignored the technology, focusing solely on the woman. Behind his iron mask, a flicker of genuine shock appeared, a rare crack in 40 years of absolute control. 7 minutes had passed, and the rhythm of life was finally holding firm. 62 beats per minute. Blood pressure at 90/60, fragile yet stable. The doctor checked the patient's pupils. The shaking had ceased. She turned to Jolene, her gaze filled with a profound reverence that the young woman would carry forever. Respect was earned. Suddenly, Santo's lids fluttered open. His steel-colored eyes were weary but sharp with returning consciousness. He surveyed the room, scanning the doctors and his brother before his gaze locked onto the stranger. He stared at the disheveled girl in the stained uniform, her hair a mess and her skin smudged with soot. In a room of pristine white coats, she looked like a smear of coal on a canvas. "Who?" he rasped, his voice sounding like stones grinding together. "Who are you?" he demanded. Jolene stood there, exhausted and battered, having just fought the Reaper with common household goods. This king of the underworld spoke with the arrogance of a man who never had to ask for a name unless he intended to destroy it. "Just your courier," she replied coldly. "The food is ruined, and you still owe me for the trouble." Santo Castellano, the man whose very whisper could end lives, let out a dry, rattling chuckle. It was a sound so rare it felt like a miracle. Killian nearly recoiled in disbelief. He hadn't seen his brother smile in an eternity. As Jolene prepared to leave, her gaze caught the discarded silk near the bed. Something about the fabric made her pause, pulling her back into the mystery. With the danger fading, she sought the detail the experts had overlooked. She flipped the corner of the lavender cloth. There, hidden in the weave, were 2 tiny hand-sewn letters, P and C. Jolene recognized the painstaking work of a human hand. Years of sewing in Chinatown had taught her the difference between a machine and a soul. Someone had marked this cloth with the signature. Knowing whose initials those were sent a lethal shiver through her heart. She was in deeper than she ever imagined. 3 days later, she was back on her knees at the restaurant, scrubbing filth from the floor. Her boss, Carmine, a man who avoided eye contact like a curse, forced her to stay late for a sauce spill. Her body ached with every movement. She endured it without a word. Silence was the price of survival for a mother with no other options. She tried to pretend the night at the penthouse was just a fever dream and that the threat of a golden pistol was behind her. She tried to bury the memory of those 2 letters, P and C, because thinking about them meant being pulled back into the abyss. She wanted Rosie to hold a pen, not a weapon. But some ghosts refused to stay buried in the dark. The roar of a high-end engine cut through the quiet afternoon. Jolene kept scrubbing, assuming it was a patron, but the heavy, measured thud of expensive shoes on the tile told her that destiny had come to collect its debt. Declan Voss loomed over her, his presence extinguishing the sunlight. He was a pillar of gray wool and unspoken threats. "This isn't a request," his eyes whispered. "The boss wants a word with you," he said aloud, his voice like iron. Jolene stood up, her joints popping with the effort. "No," she stated firmly. Declan didn't argue. He simply walked to the curb and pulled open the door of a massive black vehicle, waiting for her to accept the inevitable. The view through the glass sent a violent chill through Jolene's entire being. There sat Rosie, perched upon ivory leather like a little princess, her small legs dancing in midair. She was covered in expensive green gelato, clutching her stuffed toy and beaming with a radiance that suggested she had finally found her own personal heaven. A tub of artisan ice cream rested beside her, the elite kind from the Gold Coast that fetched $200 a container. It was a luxury Jolene could never have provided, not even in her wildest fantasies. A numbing sensation spread from her chest to her core as the horrifying truth dawned on her. This wasn't a snatch and grab, it was a demonstration of absolute reach. They had simply collected her daughter, treated her to sweets, and buckled her into a $1 million machine as if it were a common Tuesday. That casualness was the true nightmare, a silent proof that her child was never beyond their grasp. Jolene felt the weight of her own helplessness crushing her. The little girl waved, her voice bright through the window, praising the treats the driver had given her. Jolene forced a hollow smile to her lips, masking the scream in her throat because she couldn't let her daughter see the terror. She gathered the child into her arms, squeezing her with a desperate intensity before stepping into the silent, plush interior. Not a single word escaped her lips toward Declan during the long journey. 40 minutes later, the massive vehicle glided through the wrought iron gates of the Castellano fortress in Illinois. Jolene had seen mansions on the silver screen, but the sheer scale of this architectural monster left her breathless. The estate boasted 30 rooms and 5 acres of manicured wilderness, with ancient trees standing like sentinels along the path. Layers of armed surveillance watched every shadow across the rolling green meadows. Upon seeing the vast gardens, the 4-year-old let out a high-pitched cry of pure joy, the sound of a child who had lived her whole life confined to concrete. She broke away, racing onto the grass with her toy trailing behind. Declan ushered Jolene into a workspace of dark wood and heavy silence. Santo Castellano sat like a king in shadows, his dark suit crisp and his posture unyielding. Though his skin remained ghostly from the poison, those piercing gray eyes had regained their predatory edge, the look that sent tremors through the Chicago underworld, capable of dissecting a soul with a single glance. To his side, Jude Thorne stood motionless, his hand draped over a dark cane. Santo issued a one-word command to sit. Jolene obeyed, her muscles screaming after 4 hours of scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. Without a hint of emotion, he presented his proposal. His voice carried the absolute weight of a man who never expected to hear the word no. He offered $50,000 every month, a sanctuary within his fortress, elite schooling for Rosie, and a title as his lead medical consultant. Jolene stared at him. That sum was more than her 3 jobs combined earned in a year. It meant a bedroom for Rosie, a real bed, and the dental care she had been forced to neglect. It meant finally more than 4 hours of sleep. Yet she refused. She declared her desire to stay clean of his dark world. Santo didn't even blink. He watched her with the detached fascination of a grandmaster evaluating a pawn. He told her she was already neck-deep in the abyss. The moment she identified the chemical signature on that fabric, the initials PC, the dice had been cast and her fate was sealed. He leaned in, his voice vibrating with a new, heavy darkness. He pointed out the obvious. The person who tried to murder him knew what she knew. He asked if she truly believed her crumbling apartment with its broken locks and dark alleys was any place to protect a small child. Jolene remained silent, choked by the bitter realization that he was right. Her gaze drifted to the window where Rosie was a blur of motion against the lawn, her laughter seemingly piercing through the heavy glass. For the first time in her short life, the girl had enough space to run without colliding with a wall. The tragedy of their poverty was being erased by the very man Jolene feared most. Turning back to the lion in his den, Jolene stated she had requirements of her own. Santo tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his face, a dangerous expression. It was unheard of to negotiate with a Castellano. Usually this who tried ended up as part of the city's foundation. She promised to unmask his assassin, but only if he located her father, Raymond Hadley, who had vanished 4 years prior. She was certain his criminal network held the key to his whereabouts. Santo weighed her words in a heavy silence that stretched for 10 long seconds. After a subtle signal from his advisor, he accepted the terms. With a single word, the pact was sealed. There were no documents, just the terrifying understanding that she had bartered with a monster for her child's future. During her first week in that golden cage, sleep became a stranger, leaving her awake for all but 3 hours of the night. The mattress was a masterpiece of comfort, worth $40,000 according to the internet. Yet it couldn't bring her peace. She was haunted by the absence of noise. She missed the chaotic symphony of the South Side, the wailing sirens, the muffled arguments, and the rhythmic throb of street music that had always served as her lullaby. The silence of the mansion was so profound she could hear her daughters breathing in the adjacent room. It was the first time Rosie had her own sanctuary, sleeping on linens so impossibly soft that Jolene found herself checking the tags, unable to comprehend such luxury. The child adjusted with heartbreaking ease, spending her days learning the names of flowers from the staff. Watching from the window, Jolene felt a conflicting ache in her chest. She was overwhelmed with love for her daughter's joy, yet terrified by the hidden debt that had purchased this happiness. Unbeknownst to her, Santo was a constant, invisible observer. He tracked their movements through high-tech feeds on his desk and caught glimpses of them in the quiet hours of the morning. He watched through the shadows as Jolene sat on the floor, tending to her child with a devotion he didn't fully understand. He noted the way she tested the milk against her skin with clinical precision before letting Rosie drink. He listened to the weary, gravelly songs Jolene sang at night, melodies without names that acted like a physical weight, pulling the child into a deep sleep within 2 minutes. It was a level of care that felt alien to his world. Santo had never known such raw gentleness. His own mother's love had been a weapon of protection, and his father had replaced storybooks with firearms. To see a woman sacrifice her pride and her safety just to sing a wordless song to a child at 10 in the evening was deeply disturbing to him. This display of humanity left him restless, unable to look away from a life so different from his own. On the 8th night, Jolene's survival instincts took over. Once her daughter was asleep, she retreated into the digital shadows, powering up the battered laptop she had salvaged from their old life. The machine was a relic that hummed like a jet engine, but it was her only weapon. She had spent 3 years mastering the guts of computers via online tutorials because she couldn't afford $75 for a repairman. Those skills had evolved into something far more potent than simple hardware fixes. She knew how to navigate the invisible veins of a network. Despite the fortress-level security, a single oversight, perhaps a lapse by the security chief, had left a backup drive exposed on the local connection. Jolene wasn't a professional infiltrator. She was simply a desperate mother who knew exactly where the secrets were buried. Deep within a hidden folder for regional surveillance, she found it. A grainy, long-distance shot of a man trapped in a sterile laboratory. He was a ghost of his former self, his hair turned to ash and his face carved with trauma. His hand was bolted to a metal workstation. The equipment surrounding him was painfully familiar to her. It was Raymond Hadley, her father, captured just 3 weeks ago. When Jolene shut the screen, her body erupted in tremors. She had to grip her own hands for 10 seconds to keep from collapsing before she found the strength to move. She moved through the lightless corridor like a phantom, throwing open the door to the study without a word. Santos sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't flinch, his expression suggesting he had been counting the minutes until she finally arrived at his door. "You've known all along that he was alive." Santos set his glass down with a heavy thud. "Sit." "Don't you dare tell me to sit! Give me the truth!" Santos stared at her, finally offering a slow, weighted nod, the look of a man resigning himself to a storm. "Your father is a prisoner. The Ferraro family has him locked in a warehouse out in Gary, Indiana. Cristiano Ferraro snatched him 4 years ago to bridge a gap in their chemical warfare. They've forced him to cook that synthetic toxin, the same one that nearly put me in the ground last week. My scouts found him 90 days ago, but I couldn't move. With a traitor leaking our every breath, a rescue would have been his execution. They won't keep him as a pet a second time. They will end him." Jolene stood frozen, every word feeling like a lead weight dropped onto her ribs. He hadn't abandoned her. He was stolen. For 4 years, she had nursed a bitter hatred for a ghost. 4 years of telling little Rosie that Grandpa had just gone away because she lacked the heart to say he had simply walked out on them. And through those years, my father was in chains, brewing the very death he once taught me to identify by smell. You knew, and you stayed silent. Her voice began to shake, fueled by a searing heat rising from her chest to her throat. "He is being broken while you sit here, sipping top-shelf whiskey and hoarding your little secrets." "If I had told you," Santo countered, his voice a flat line, even as his eyes burned with a strange intensity, "you would have sped to Gary that same night with nothing but hope and a death wish. You would be dead, and if you're gone, who is left to save me next time?" "Stop making my tragedy about your survival," she hissed. Jolene lunged forward, closing the space until they were barely an arm's length apart. "You didn't trap me here for my medical skills. You kept me because you were terrified." The word "afraid" seemed to freeze the air. Usually calling Santo Castellano a coward was a death sentence, but the rage never came. He rose with a slow, predatory grace and caught her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He pulled her into his space until she could feel the heat of his breath and the scent of sandalwood and scotch clinging to his suit. His steel-gray eyes searched hers, stripped of the cold, calculating mask he usually wore. There was a flicker of something raw in his gaze, a vulnerability he hadn't realized he possessed until this very second. Suddenly, he released her as if her skin were white-hot iron. He stepped back, turning his gaze to the shadows as his hand tightened into a fist. "Go to bed, Jolene," he rasped. "Tomorrow we bring him home." She stood there for 3 long seconds before retreating, leaning against the cold hallway wall, as the door clicked shut. Her wrist still hummed where he had touched her. By morning, she was at the small wooden desk in her workspace, staring at a blank sheet of paper before etching 2 letters, PC. The truth had been rotting in her mind since she found that monogrammed cloth. Phoebe Castellano, 40 years old, Santo's half-sister, the daughter of a first marriage the old man had tried to bury. Phoebe had spent her life's perimeter of the family, close enough to smell the power but never allowed to taste it. When the patriarch passed, the crown went to Santo, the favorite son, leaving Phoebe to swallow her pride. She became the ghost in the counting house, managing the billions and the offshore accounts with a perfection that shielded her from suspicion. She never asked for more, which was exactly why no one ever looked her way. But Jolene required hard evidence. She spent the next 72 hours playing the shadow, watching Phoebe move through the state. She caught the pattern. Every Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon, the black Mercedes would roll out, Phoebe claiming she needed to audit the records at the central office. That Wednesday, Jolene secured a vehicle under the pretext of a supply run for Rosie. Instead of heading for the shops, she trailed the Mercedes into the heart of the city. Phoebe didn't go to any office. She pulled up at a high-end art gallery in River North, where the paintings cost more than a suburban home. Jolene watched through the glass from a block away. Phoebe was deep in conversation with a younger woman in a crimson dress, a woman with the kind of polished, vacant smile that only comes from old money. It was Gianna Ferraro, the daughter of the man holding Jolene's father captive. Jolene captured the betrayal on her phone. It was the ultimate double cross. Phoebe was feeding the Ferraros everything: Santo's movements, his habits, even the very secrets of his bedroom. In exchange, the Ferraros would clear the path for Phoebe to take the throne once Santo was in the ground. The monogrammed cloth wasn't a blunder. It was a calling card. Phoebe wanted her mark on the weapon that finished him. She needed the other families to see her ruthlessness before she claimed the seat. Meanwhile, Killian was digging into Silas Marchetti, the doctor whose nerves had snapped the night Santo almost died. Killian didn't need a laptop to find answers. He just needed a gold-plated handgun and a quiet room. Every banker talks when the barrel of a pistol is on the table. The paper trail was damning. Silas had been fed $250,000 over 6 months from a shell company tied directly to the Ferraros. The doctor hadn't used a blade. He had simply suggested the mint tea for sleep and the lavender-infused silk pillowcases for stress. He didn't have to murder the boss. He just had to leave the door unlocked for the poison to walk in. That night, Jolene sat in the dark, staring at an old video on her phone. It was a grainy clip from 4 years ago, filmed in the amber light of her father's basement lab. Raymond was leaning over her 13-year-old self, his hands steady as he taught her how to mix solutions. When the chemicals fizzed blue, they both erupted into a laughter that Jolene still felt in her soul. "My girl is the finest scientist in the world," Raymond had said in the video, his voice a ghost of the man she remembered. Jolene hit pause, weeping silently as she compared that vibrant face to the skeletal, broken man she'd seen in the leaked surveillance photos. She'd learned to cry without a sound long ago, but the floorboards groaned and the door creaked open. Little Rosie stood there, her hair a mess, and her one-eyed teddy bear, Mr. Boots, trailing on the floor. "Are you hurting, Mommy?" she whispered. Jolene wiped her face in a frantic blur, but it was too late to hide the grief. "No, baby, I'm okay." Rosie didn't believe her. She climbed onto the mattress and pushed the bear into Jolene's arms. "Mr. Boots can hold the sad parts for you." The child curled into her side and drifted off within minutes. Jolene held her daughter and the bear, finally letting a small, broken sob escape. In the shadows of the hallway, Santo stood perfectly still. He had been passing by when he heard the child wake. Through the crack in the door, he saw the raw tableau of a mother's love and a daughter's comfort. For a fleeting second, he wasn't a mob boss. He was a boy again, looking at his own mother. Margarita had held him just like that the night before the poison took her. She had whispered her love in a voice that was fading from his memory like an old photograph. He turned and walked away into the darkness, his fists clenched so tight that his knuckles looked like white stones. Holding her little girl tight, Jolene finally let out a soft, fractured sob, just a whisper of sound, but enough to haunt the silence. In the shadows of the hallway, Santo Castellano remained paralyzed. He had been passing when the girl's door creaked open, his instinct forcing him to pause. Through the sliver of light, he watched Jolene weep as the child offered her bear, and for one heartbeat, he saw his own mother again. It was the exact way Margarita held him the night before the poison took her. She had whispered her love, but that melody was a ghost he could not quite grasp anymore, no matter how many nights he chased it. He slipped away into the gloom, his fist clenched so fiercely that his knuckles turned ivory against the dark. A silent departure left only a steaming mug and an unsigned scrap of paper on her desk. "We will find," it promised. But as she sifted through the digital ghosts of the server, the warmth of the brew vanished, replaced by a chill that seeped into her very marrow. Her digital footprint wasn't hers alone. For 7 days, a shadow had stalked every click, every image, and every private moment. The trail led straight to Jude Thorne's pocket. 40 years of unwavering service to the family, yet here he was, haunting her signal. Was he a guardian angel or a jailer in disguise? At 6 a.m, the library was a tomb of leather and dust. Jude sat like a statue, his dark cane leaning against the chair as Earl Grey tea sent thin ribbons of steam into the air. He didn't flinch when she entered. He'd likely tracked her footsteps from the moment she left her bed, far too weary for the theater of surprise. "You were watching," she declared, her fists white at her sides. She fought to keep her composure, even as the tension in her jaw threatened to crack bone. "For 7 days, you saw everything. My father's face, my pursuit of Phoebe. You witnessed it all and chose silence." Jude took a slow sip before finally meeting her gaze, with eyes that had watched the Castellano dynasty bleed through 3 generations. "My vigilance is for Santo," he remarked, his tone as glassily calm as dawn water. "I wasn't guarding him against you, Jolene. I was guarding him against your recklessness." Your discoveries were impressive, but a solitary charge into Gary, Indiana, would have been a death sentence. Ferraro would have executed your father before you even touched the latch, burying every shred of proof with him. The urge to scream at his arrogance was there, but it died in her throat. The jagged edge of his logic cut deeper than any insult because she knew he was right. "Then show me where your heart lies," she whispered, a slow challenge. After 5 heavy seconds of silence, Jude drew a folded paper from his coat. He laid it between them like a peace offering. It held a set of coordinates and a single destination. Industrial Way. "The heart of Ferraro's operation," he stated. 4 sentries outside, 2 within, and a 3-story descent into a subterranean lab. Your father is at the very bottom. As she took the paper, her fingers trembled. Why me, and not the boss? Because Santo is a chess player. He would calculate until the opportunity rotted, leaving your father to wither in iron for another day. You, however, lack the patience for shadows, and tonight, that is exactly what is required. Locating Killian was simple. Past 10 o'clock, he was always in the basement range, drowning the memory of his brother's near death in a rhythmic storm of gunfire until the tremors in his hands finally subsided. She laid out the pieces, Silas, Ferraro, her living father, omitting only the heat of Santo's grip on her arm. Killian swapped his empty magazine for a full one, his response a jagged two-word blade. What time? By 3 in the morning, they reached a skeletal warehouse at the edge of Gary, swallowed by the rusted ghosts of forgotten industry. To a casual eye, it was just another rusted corpse of a building. But Jolene saw the anomalies. Modern lenses peering from dead street lamps, fresh ventilation cutting through the roof, and deep tire ruts in the muck. It was a fortress masquerading as a ruin. Killian moved with the lethal grace of a boy who'd been taught to kill at 16. The outer sentries fell like shadows, and the interior duo didn't even have time to scream into their radios. As they descended the narrow, black throat of the stairwell, the air grew thick with the biting sting of industrial poisons. Reaching the floor, she was hit by a perverted version of her childhood. The scent of her father's Southside lab, now choked and rotten. There sat Raymond Hadley, a ghost of his former self, 40 pounds of life stripped from his frame. He was shackled to the very table that served as his cage. His hair was a shock of winter white, his face a landscape of hollows and sharp bone. A jagged silver line traced his arm from wrist to elbow. When he looked up, the warmth she remembered had been replaced by a hollow exhaustion so profound he seemed to mistake her for a hallucination. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice a jagged scrape of sound. Jolene fell to her knees, paralyzed by the sight of the chains and the 2 decades of aging etched into his face over just 4 years. She finally unleashed the grief of 1,460 days. "You were gone. Not a single word. I thought you'd simply abandoned me." Raymond's eyes drifted shut as tears carved paths through newfound wrinkles. "Ferraro wanted me to brew death, and when I declined, they shattered 3 of my fingers." He held up a hand where the bones had knitted back into a twisted, gnarled mess. "Next, they showed me photos of you and Rosie on South Ashland. It was a simple ultimatum, serve or lose my family. So I took the shackles. I brewed their filth but tainted every batch, playing a deadly game of sabotage until my deception was finally laid bare." She pulled him close, only for him to whisper a name that turned her blood to ice. "Derek?" he breathed. "You sent him to find me, didn't you?" Jolene froze. "He actually succeeded, but he disturbed the wrong hornet's nest. He touched names that belonged to Ferraro. They silenced him. That fireball on Interstate 90 wasn't a mechanical failure, it was a hit. The weight of it crushed her. Derek was dead because of her curiosity. She knew she should mourn the father of her child, but the sheer gravity of the betrayal left her numb. On that freezing floor, the world collapsed around her, reality folding like a house of cards. Then, a shriek pierced the gloom. The alarm. Crimson strobes painted the walls in the colors of an emergency, signaling that their time had finally run out. 2 minutes until they're on us, Killian roared. Jolene sheared through the iron links and hauled her father up. Despite his weakness, Raymond lunged for the terminal, yanking a drive from the port. "Take this," he gasped. "The recipes, the ledgers, the evidence of Ferraro's puppets is all here." "My insurance, in case I never made it out." Killian lunged into view, his shoulder a blossoming flower of scarlet. A round had torn straight through his muscle, yet his aim remained true. He barked 2 rounds into the dark, rewarded by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. "Go!" Killian's command was the thunderclap. Jolene hauled her father upward, his trembling weight leaning heavily on her as they fought for every step. Behind them, Killian acted as a bleeding shield, his weapon tracking every movement in the blackness, his lifeblood painting the stairs as he held the line. They burst into the freezing night, fleeing the echoes of gunfire. Killian steered with a single hand, the other clamped over his leaking shoulder as the car screamed away from the sirens. In the rear, Raymond clutched Jolene's hand. "Forgive me," he croaked. Santo was aware the entire time. Whether the leak was Declan, Jude, or some untraceable shadow, she'd never know. But as she pulled into the estate at 5 a.m, her skin still stinking of cordite and filth, she found Santo waiting in the hall like a silent judgment. He surveyed the wreckage, the broken father, the bleeding brother, and the defiant woman. Silence reigned. Jolene prepared for the storm. She had deceived the Midwest's most ruthless kingpin and risked his kin for a personal crusade. In this life, such a betrayal usually ended in a shallow grave. Santo remained unnervingly calm. Reaching out, he claimed the drive from Jolene, his gaze lingering on the plastic for a single heartbeat before those cold, metallic eyes pierced hers. "In the future, I expect total transparency," he uttered softly. Turning to his man, he commanded, "Find a medic for Killian and prepare the master suite for our guest, Mr. Hadley." No outburst followed, no retribution fell. Yet Jolene sensed she had just stepped across a boundary where others found only death, and Santo had simply waved her through. For the next 2 days, the world narrowed to a locked study where Santo and Jude remained hidden. Outside, Declan stood as a silent sentinel, denying entry to everyone, even their closest enforcer. When the doors finally opened, Santo emerged with a strategy that Jolene only grasped in fleeting, terrifying fragments. Each detail a testament to his cold, calculating mind. Phoebe had already choreographed a high-stakes summit at the family estate for that evening, an event weeks in the making, drawing 7 titans of the underworld from Chicago to New York, including the formidable Cristiano Ferraro. On paper, they gathered to weigh Santo's health and his right to rule. In reality, it was Phoebe's stage to strip him of his crown and seize the throne with Ferraro's blessing. Santo saw every move at the board, yet instead of shutting the doors, he invited the storm to break at 7 o'clock that evening. The great hall was a cathedral for secrets never meant for ink. Around a 20-seat oak behemoth, flickering white candles bled wax onto the wood, while deep red wine glowed in crystal stems. Golden light showered from the ceiling like a gilded shroud over 7 kings, each one a sovereign of his own dark territory, guarded by silent men of violence. At the head of the table, occupying the space opposite Santo's ghost, sat 50-year-old Cristiano Ferraro, his silver hair perfectly sculpted and his smile as sharp as his pale gray suit. Beside the empty throne stood Phoebe in a mourning black gown, her hair elegant, her wine glass steady as she wore the triumphant expression she had spent 40 years perfecting in the shadows. "We are all aware of Santo's recent frailty. As the family's financial architect and senior voice, I move that." Her words died as the heavy doors groaned open. The rhythmic strike of heels against the wood sounded like a countdown to a funeral. Santo Castellano stepped into the light, clad in a black 3-piece suit and silver links, the very image of a resurrected god. Though his face bore the pallor of a ghost, his spine was a rod of tempered steel, and his gray eyes scanned the assembly with the terrifying peace of a reaper. Jude Thorne followed, his dark cane marking time against the floor. while Declan Voss trailed behind, one hand buried deep in a coat pocket, his fingers surely coiled around cold iron. Phoebe's composure shattered instantly. Her hand trembled, sending a single bead of red wine to the table like a fresh drop of blood. Cristiano, however, merely let his smile fade, a silent admission of his miscalculation. "Santo," he acknowledged with a measured nod. "Few expected to see you standing so soon." "Expectations are often failings," Santo replied, claiming his seat with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes locked onto Cristiano's. "That is the fatal error of those who mistake my silence for weakness." He then cast his gaze upward toward the second-floor gallery, a vantage point his ancestors had used to watch for treachery. Jolene emerged from the velvet shadows of the balcony. To her left was Raymond, gaunt and scarred but standing tall, his eyes burning with the fire that 4 years of torment couldn't quench. On her right stood Killian, his shoulder bound in white linen stained with old copper, yet his presence was as heavy as the stone walls. A gold-plated pistol hung steady in Killian's grip, its barrel angled toward the floor. In silence, Jolene touched a screen, and 4 massive monitors Phoebe had prepared for her own coronation flickered to life. The display was no longer a transition of power, but a ledger of sins. The first screen laid bare Phoebe's treachery. $2 million bled into a Cayman account tied to Ferraro's front companies. Every signature a confession. The second screen flickered with haunting footage of Raymond Hadley, a ghost in chains, forced to brew shadows in a subterranean cage. His hollow eyes seemed to stare through the very glass at his captors. The third screen detailed the chemical blueprint of the synthetic toxin, littered with Raymond's secret notes of sabotage. Finally, the fourth monitor exposed the $250,000 paid to the doctor, alongside the digital trail of orders to poison Santo's very breath. "Lies!" Phoebe shrieked, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "This is all a fabrication. Cristiano and this street girl are trying to bury me, Santo." The room went deathly still. In her desperation, she had used his first name, a slip of intimacy that betrayed her secret alliance with the man who sought her brother's life. The mistake hung in the air like a noose. Cristiano Ferraro remained a statue of silence, neither denying the charge nor moving an inch. But for the first time in 5 decades, a single bead of sweat traced a path down his jaw. In their world, that tiny drop carried the crushing weight of a death sentence. Santo rose, his footsteps echoing like a tolling bell as he circled the table. He came to a halt before Phoebe. "You always coveted this seat," he murmured, his voice possessing a terrifying soft tenderness. In the Castellana world, such a whisper was far more lethal than any roar of anger. But you failed to realize the throne is held together by the marrow of traitors. Suddenly, the world went black. It wasn't an accident, but a deliberate eclipse. Darkness fell like a heavy lid, followed by the muffled, surgical rhythm of silenced gunfire. Killian's ghosts, equipped with the eyes of predators, moved through the void with lethal precision. When the lights flickered back to life 10 seconds later, Ferraro's guards were neutralized on the floor in plastic ties. Cristiano sat paralyzed, his face a mask of ash. Phoebe was collapsed on the cold marble, her hands bound and her dress torn. The practiced smile of 40 years replaced by a mask of pure terror. The 7 representatives sat in stunned silence, realizing this wasn't a rebellion they were witnessing. It was a sentencing. Santo looked back to the gallery where Jolene, Raymond, and Killian stood as his silent jury. The glow of the tablet illuminated the girl who had changed everything. Santo offered a single, almost invisible nod, not the command of a boss, but a rare, heavy gesture of true gratitude. "Thank you," he mouthed. Suddenly, the phone in Jolene's hand pulsed. A message from Bryn arrived. 4 words that turned the blood in her veins to ice. "Rosie has a fever! Hospital!" The world of Mafia kings vanished. Jolene didn't utter a word. She abandoned the tablet, descended the stairs, and walked past the broken shell of Phoebe and the pale ghost of Cristiano. She ignored the chaos of enforcers and the tactical chatter of Declan's radio, moving through the foyer like a woman possessed. She climbed into her battered pickup, a rusted anomaly parked among a sea of silver and chrome, and tore away from the estate. No one dared block her path. Perhaps they didn't understand, or perhaps they simply recognized the unstoppable, primal force of a mother whose child was in danger. Stroger Hospital loomed, a fortress of fluorescent humming and the scent of chemical clean at 10 o'clock at night. Jolene sprinted through the ward, her clothes still dusted with the grime of a warehouse and the mud of a secret lab. She was a vision of war entering a house of healing. Bryn was waiting outside room 412, looking frayed with a cold cup of coffee in her grip. "An ear infection," she whispered immediately to stem the panic. "The doctors say she'll recover and the meds are already working. But she cried for you until she had nothing left." Jolene eased the door open. Rosie looked so fragile amidst the vast white sheets, her face flushed with heat and her breath coming in shallow sighs. It was the heavy, hollow sleep of the exhausted. And there, tucked beside her under the IV lines, was Mr. Boots, her silent, loyal protector. Jolene sank into the plastic seat, moving like a ghost to avoid disturbing the girl. Yet the child's eyes fluttered open instantly, as if her soul recognized its anchor. That whispered "Mama" was barely a breath, fragile and worn. Pulling the little girl close, Jolene cradled her against her chest, offering her scent as the only true sanctuary. There she sat, paralyzed by the weight of her own history. She stared at the palms now brushing her daughter's hair, the same palms that once crushed charcoal into life-saving cures in a cold penthouse. These were the fingers that bled over keyboards to bypass security walls, the same hands that dragged her father through lead in a Gary warehouse. These hands had exposed the sins of the elite, stopping a lethal plot from the shadows of a banquet hall. Now they were relegated to the simple, agonizing task of soothing a fever-stricken 4-year-old in a crowded ward. Perhaps this, and only this, was the purpose they were truly forged for. Not the violence, but the tenderness. 40 minutes passed before Raymond stepped off the curb, arriving in a hired car with nothing but the borrowed suit on his back and 4 years of scars he wished to erase. He paused at the threshold, watching his daughter hold the child. Those eyes, once hardened by chemical equations and poison formulas, finally surrendered to the salt of tears. The child looked up, meeting the gaze of the ghost in the doorway. Clutching her toy, she sought her mother's silent nod before whispering, "Are you Grandpa?" She'd seen the photo in her mother's purse 1,000 times. In that heartbeat, the man's iron resolve crumbled like a dam bursting under the weight of 4 years of silent agony. He wept, the heavy, ragged grief of a 58-year-old man who had traded his bones and his dignity for their safety. Seeing the worn photograph meant he hadn't been erased. He was still the hero in his daughter's memory. Jolene reached out, drawing the broken man toward the narrow hospital mattress, making room for his soul to rest. The little girl offered up her stuffed rabbit, her most prized possession, as a silent peace offering to the weeping man. 3 generations huddled on that cramped hospital bed. the child in the center, the mother leaning into the grandfather, and his scarred, trembling arm shielding them both from the darkness of the world outside. For the first time in 4 years, the stars seemed to align correctly. As midnight approached, Jolene's raspy voice wove a jagged lullaby for her daughter. Raymond sat there, eyes shut tight, absorbing the melody like a man drinking water in a desert, finding a peace he thought the chains had stolen from him forever. Clear's throat. Beyond the glass, a shadow loomed in the sterile hallway. Santo Castellano stood in solitude. No guards, no soldiers, just a man in a black coat leaning against the cold wall. He watched the tableau of family through the window. The singing mother, the sleeping child, the old man finally finding his way home. He observed the scene like a starving man watching a feast he'd never been invited to. His own mother was a ghost by 19, and his father, the former king, had taught him that love was a fatal flaw. No one had ever hummed to him in the dark. No one had ever held his hand through the fever. That 30-room palace had been a tomb, not a residence. He turned to flee from the sight, but the door creaked open. Jolene stood before him, her uniform caked in the grime of a long day, her eyes weary but sharp. "Do you intend to stand guard in the corridor until dawn?" she asked softly. Santo's gaze drifted past her to the old man dozing and the child's steady breathing. "I'm not sure of my role inside that room," he admitted, the rarest moment of truth in his 36 years. Jolene watched him for a heartbeat, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper. "Just sit down and be still. That is enough." He crossed the threshold, settling into a rigid plastic chair that felt alien compared to his velvet thrones. As he sat in the silence, the feverish child shifted, her small hand wandering until her tiny fingers curled around his index finger. It was a primitive search for warmth, a fragile tether from a 4-year-old who knew nothing of his sins. "You have such big hands," the child mumbled into her dreams. Santo looked down at the limb that had choked out lives and signed death warrants. Now it was being held captive by 5 small fingers that sensed no danger. The girl didn't tremble. She didn't know the blood that stained the palm she now trusted. He remained. The Titan of the Midwest sat in a public ward on Chicago's South Side, letting a child hold him hostage until morning. 2 weeks later, at the Lake Forest Estate, the sunset bled violet and orange over Illinois. It was the kind of lingering light that feels like the sun is afraid to say goodbye. Down below, Rosie was a whirlwind of mud and laughter, mocking her grandfather for planting the mint with its roots kissing the sky. Raymond laughed, a rusty, beautiful sound from a throat that had forgotten how. Covered in the same dirt as the child, he looked at her with eyes that were finally starting to see light again. With fingers bent and gnarled from the torturer's hands, Raymond carefully tucked the herbs into the soil. He kept the secret to himself. That mint was the very first thing he'd taught his daughter to nurture 2 decades ago in a basement far from here. Some things are better left unsaid, whispered only by the wind. High on the terrace, Jolene swirled a glass of red wine, her eyes never leaving the garden. She took small, cautious sips, still marveling at how different this vintage tasted compared to the bitter, cheap bottles she'd choked down in her cramped studio. Here, even the air felt like a privilege she hadn't yet earned. Santo was a quiet presence beside her, his whiskey catching the dying light. He watched her as much as he watched the horizon, stealing glances like a man trying to memorize the sun without going blind. The silence between them was heavy but comfortable, the kind earned only by those who have survived the same storm. "I have no concept of a quiet life," Santo murmured, his voice a low rumble against the Chicago skyline. It wasn't a lament, but a confession whispered into the dusk. In his world, showing your cards was a death sentence, but here, under the fading light, he let the mask slip just a fraction. "You aren't the only one," Jolene replied, her focus remaining on the child below. She thought of the 4 years of exhaustion, the rusted truck, and the cold meals. "I spent a lifetime just trying to keep our heads above water." She looked at him with a tired, honest smile. "Peace is a luxury we couldn't afford." The quiet returned, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the garden. Downstairs, the child chased a grandfather who was pretending to be afraid of a garden worm. Their joy drifted upward, a sharp contrast to the 2 broken souls on the balcony. Santo looked at Jolene, and for once the predator was gone. There was no boss, no executioner, no cold prince of the underworld. Just a 36-year-old man who had never known a mother's song. He stood there, yearning for a connection he didn't have the vocabulary to describe. "Stay," he whispered. A command stripped of its power, leaving only the raw bone of a plea. Jolene met his gaze, her voice steady. "Is that a decree from the throne, or are you truly asking me?" Santo didn't answer immediately. He let the wind carry a stray oak leaf across the stones until it rested at her feet. The silence stretched until it nearly broke under the weight of his uncharacteristic hesitation. Finally, he spoke, his voice so faint it was almost lost to the evening breeze. It was the sound of a man dismantling a lifetime of armor, uttering words his pride had never allowed before. "For the first time in my existence," he breathed, "I am asking you." Jolene gave no verbal reply. Setting her wine aside, she rested her palm over his, a hand toughened by endless miles of driving and the ache of manual labor. This hand, which had once brewed a desperate cure in a kitchen, now touched the jagged scars of a Mafia king. A man whose fingers had pulled triggers and signed death warrants, yet spent the previous night letting a 4-year-old child cling to him in a hospital bed. 2 separate realities rested side by side on that iron seat as the Chicago sun bled into the horizon. Below, Rosie's laughter rang out because her grandfather had dirt on his face again. This woman had not arrived in a motorcade or a private jet. She had not come with an invitation to the inner circle. She pulled up in a battered truck with a cold food order and a sleeping 4-year-old clutching a tattered, one-eyed toy. She accomplished what 15 world-class surgeons could not through skill, but because she saw the world through the eyes of someone who had lost everything and never stopped searching for hope. She did not just save his life. She gave him a reason to want it. That was the miracle, not the charcoal mixture in a steel bowl. But the moment a man who never knew love met a woman who had never been loved right, and both decided they might just learn how together. This tale proves that the person who shifts the world is not always the strongest or the wealthiest. Often it is the one the world ignored. It is the single mother working 3 shifts on 4 hours of rest, still finding the strength to sing her child to sleep with a voice raspy from exhaustion. True grit is not found in power, but in the heart of someone who refuses to quit when life gives them every reason to fall. If Jolene's fire or Santo's quiet pain reached you tonight, please hit the like button and share this with those you cherish. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these midnight reflections every single day. I want to hear what stirred in your soul. What part of this journey moved you? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, because a story is only whole when it is heard and told once more. I wish you health, a life of meaning, and a quiet peace in every tomorrow. Thank you for walking through the night with us. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next story.